Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're plunging into the presidency of James Monroe, who was the fifth U.S. president.
That's right. And we've got some interesting material lined up, sources from the Constitution Center and the White House Historical Association.
Exactly. We're aiming to really get under the surface of Monroe.
Yeah, because there's this seeming contradiction, isn't there? He's called the last founding father president.
Mm-hmm.
And his time was the era of good feelings. Sounds pretty smooth.
Right. But then, compared to Washington or Jefferson or even Madison, maybe he doesn't quite jump out in the same way.
That's the puzzle. Is he underrated? Or is the era of good feelings label maybe hiding some complexities?
That's what we want to unpack today. Look beyond that label, explore his life, his presidency.
Find some perhaps surprising details, really get into the nuances of that time.
Definitely. We've got these articles, biographical stuff, historical context. This should be good.
Okay, let's dive in.
So James Monroe, born April 28, 1758, Virginia.
And from an affluent background. Slave-owning family, the sources note.
Yeah, that context is important right from the start. He went to Campbelltown Academy, briefly College of William and Mary.
But then the revolution breaks out.
And he gets involved young, enlisted in the Continental Army.
He was only 18 and wounded at the Battle of Trenton. That's pretty significant.
It really is. The Constitution Center mentions he was a lieutenant and that Washington himself sent him to scout across the Delaware right before the battle. Imagine that at 18.
Wow. That kind of experience right at the nation's founding. It must shape you profoundly.
Absolutely. So after the war, he shifts gears, studies law.
Under Thomas Jefferson, no less.
Right. Though apparently law wasn't his main calling. Politics seems to have been the bigger draw.
Well, studying under Jefferson certainly wouldn't hurt your political connections.
No kidding. And pretty quickly, he's in public service. Continental Congress at just 25.
That's young. Then the Virginia General Assembly, the U.S. Senate.
And governor of Virginia, too. A really solid political career building early on.
And those connections, those relationships with the other big names, they seem really key and, sometimes complicated.
Jefferson, definitely a mentor figure. Monroe even bought land near Monticello Highland.
Right. But with Madison and Washington, maybe a bit more friction at times.
Seems so. With Madison, initially they were on opposite sides regarding the Constitution's ratification in Virginia. Monroe wanted a strong Bill of Rights.
Okay.
And get this, they actually ran against each other for a House seat in 1789, had public debates and everything.
Really? Who won?
Madison won, narrowly. But the interesting part, they became close friends after that.
Huh. Shows a different kind of politics back then, maybe. You could disagree strongly, but still find common ground personally.
It seems like it. Now, Washington, that was different.
Yeah, what happened there?
Well, Washington made Monroe ambassador to France, but then fired him. Apparently, Monroe was critical of the Jay Treaty.
Ah, okay, so a definite falling out. And sounds like he wasn't a fan of Alexander Hamilton either.
Doesn't seem like it. These relationships, the agreements, the disagreements, they're fascinating. They weren't monolithic, these founders.
Not at all. And Monroe's diplomatic resume was, pretty extensive even before he became president. Lots of posts in Europe.
He really knew the international scene.
Which surely helped him later on. That experience matters.
Absolutely. And it paid off hugely with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Ah, yes. Under Jefferson. He sent Monroe and Robert Livingston to France.
Their goal was basically New Orleans and access to the Mississippi.
Right. Just secure the port. Yeah. But they came back with, everything.
The whole territory. For $15 million, they massively exceeded expectations.
It's an incredible moment. Ooh. But, as the White House Historical Association points out, it had major downsides, too.
Definitely. Great for white settlers moving west.
But devastating for Native American populations. And it just poured fuel on the fire of the slavery debate as the country expanded.
Yeah, it's that complexity again. A huge win, but with really serious negative consequences baked in.
A classic example of how history is rarely simple.
So all this experience, military, legal, political, diplomatic, leads him to the presidency. Elected in 1816.
And with a strong majority, right? 68% of the vote against Rufus King.
Then in 1820, he runs unopposed, gets 81% of the vote.
Almost unanimous in the Electoral College. Just one elector dissented.
That kind of political dominance is, it's rare.
And that's the core of the era of good feelings, isn't it? Relative political peace, economic growth, this sense of national unity after the War of 1812.
Yeah, the White House Historical Association mentions his goodwill tours around the country probably helped build that feeling.
Fostering that national identity.
And there were concrete achievements, too, rebuilding Washington after the British burned parts of it.
Right, restoring the president's house and other buildings.
But the big one, the one everyone remembers, is the Monroe Doctrine, 1823.
Absolutely pivotal. It basically told Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere's affairs.
Yeah.
No new colonies, no interference with the new republics.
And in return, the U.S. would stay out of European conflicts.
A defining moment for U.S. foreign policy. It's important to note, though, that John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State, was a major force behind crafting it. Monroe announced it in his message to Congress, but Adams really helped shape it.
So a collaborative effort, even though it carries Monroe's name. Still, it set a course for generations.
Absolutely. A fundamental statement of America's place in the world, you could say.
And before that doctrine, there was also the acquisition of Florida.
Right, from Spain.
Yeah.
That negotiation actually started under Madison when Monroe was Secretary of State.
And finalized under President Monroe for $5 million.
The U.S. paid off some Spanish damage claims and, importantly, recognized Spanish control over Texas as part of that deal.
Another significant territorial gain, securing that whole southeastern flank.
Strategically vital. But again, highlights the ongoing expansion and the tricky international balancing act.
And internally, there was the Missouri Compromise in 1820.
Can't forget that one. A really big deal. It was an attempt to deal with slavery in the new territories being carved out of the Louisiana Purchase.
How did it work again?
Basically, Missouri came in as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and it drew a line across the rest of the territory slavery banned north of the line, allowed south of it.
A temporary fix, really.
Exactly. It didn't solve the underlying tension, just sort of managed it for a while, postponed the inevitable conflict, as you said, but a major piece of legislation he signed.
Shifting gears a bit to his personal life, he married Elizabeth Courtwright.
Yes, and they had 3 children.
Owned multiple properties, including Highland, that plantation near Jefferson's place.
And this is crucial. The sources state he owned over 200 enslaved people.
Yeah, who worked on his properties, and some even came with the family to Washington, to the White House itself.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? The leader of a nation founded on liberty, himself deeply involved in the institution of slavery.
It's that central paradox of the era and of so many of the founders. How do you reconcile those ideals with that reality?
You have to confront it directly, I think. It's essential for an honest understanding, moving past any kind of sanitized version of the era of good feelings. That good feeling certainly wasn't universal.
No, absolutely not. It adds a very sobering layer to the idea of national unity. And then his death. July 4th, 1831.
Which is remarkable in itself. He's the 3rd president to die on Independence Day.
Jefferson and Adams both died on July 4th, 1826.
Incredible coincidence.
And one last interesting fact from the Constitution Center, Monroe was the last president who was never photographed.
Really anchors him in that pre-photography era, doesn't it? The end of that specific generation of leaders.
So summing up, Monroe's presidency, often painted as this peaceful era of good feelings,
was actually built on a lifetime of really varied and intense experiences. War, law, diplomacy, high-stakes negotiation.
He dealt with major territorial expansion, complex relationships with other founders, and laid down a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy.
But that era also saw the deepening of the conflict over slavery, even with compromises like Missouri's and the often ignored costs of expansion.
So the key takeaways. Monroe was far more experienced and his presidency more complex than the simple label suggests.
Right. Revolutionary service, deep diplomatic background, navigating tricky personal and political relationships.
The Louisiana Purchase, Florida, the Monroe Doctrine, huge policy moments.
But always with those undercurrents, particularly slavery, and its expansion bubbling beneath the surface of supposed harmony.
It makes you think about how we frame history, doesn't it? That era of good feelings label is catchy.
But it smooths over so much tension and complexity. It highlights how historical narratives get constructed and sometimes simplified.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. We call it the era of good feelings. But Monroe navigated huge challenges, set precedents for foreign policy, and presided over simmering internal conflicts.
So maybe ask yourself, what parts of this supposedly harmonious period actually deserve a much closer look today? What tensions were being capered over?
And what does that tell us about how history gets written and perhaps sometimes how it gets misunderstood by focusing too much on a simple label?
Definitely something to think about.
It certainly is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. you.